Welcome back to Anxious Faith. I'm James Burke. Now, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, you know that OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is a really difficult mental illness to deal with, and it's more prevalent than most of us realise. OCD means having intrusive thoughts that you cannot control around a particular issue. That's the obsession. And then those thoughts cause an incredible amount of anxiety unless you complete a certain action you feel compelled to do. That's the compulsive side of it. Within the family of obsessive compulsive disorders, there are a number of different subtypes. But what if your OCD is about your faith? This episode we're chatting with Mary, who suffers from religious OCD or scrupulosity, a type where the obsession and intrusive thoughts are all focused around religion and faith. Now, having grown up in a family of faith all her life, this has been an incredibly difficult journey for Mary. Now, we're going to take a minute here and make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand what we're talking about. Mary doesn't hugely go into what OCD is, so it's important in understanding her story that we all start from a similar baseline knowledge. So, here's a very quick crash course on OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder is one of the more common mental illnesses that people suffer from, and it affects more people than you think. 3% of Australians experience OCD. Now, it is different from an anxiety disorder in that it comes in the forms of intrusive thoughts that will pop into your mind seemingly out of nowhere, that are unusual, bothersome, disturbing, and hard or completely impossible to stop thinking about. Say you're about to go to sleep and you have the sudden thought, did I lock the front door? Now, checking that you did lock the front door is useful to put that thought at ease, and it's a legitimate concern. However, having intrusive thoughts that you can't stop, that you need to check the locks exactly 6 times, or something bad will happen, isn't normal, and it's not helpful. Likewise, remembering to wash your hands before you eat is good hygiene and can keep you safe from illnesses. But having an overwhelming need to scrub your hands every single time you touch something different, that's not helpful, and that's the realm of OCD. Now, where OCD differs from the normal legitimate concerns like these, many of us might have had them as well, is that the intrusive thoughts don't stop until you complete the compulsion, even though logically you might know that you don't need to worry about it. As the thoughts keep coming, your sense of anxiety grows with it. And this makes up the obsession part of the OCD. Now, as these thoughts keep growing and the anxiety grows with them, to stop this impending sense of doom or the thought that something terrible will happen, that's where the compulsion comes in. For example, the compulsion to lock your door numerous times or wash your hands to the point they're raw. It's all because your intrusive thoughts are telling you they're not clean, and you have to do this to make sure they are. Now, for Mary or others suffering with a religious type of OCD, that means that all of the intrusive thoughts are focused on questions about her faith, such as whether God is real and if the Bible can be trusted. And although these are questions that we've probably all asked during our faith journeys, for Mary these thoughts are inescapable. Even after digging into the Word of God herself or seeking reassurance from trusted people or pastors to try and put her mind at ease, the intrusive thoughts don't stop and continue asking those questions. And this is where we see how debilitating OCD can be, because it's so often unseen. The battle is fought within the mind so much of the time. And even though people with OCD might recognise that the compulsions are illogical and won't truly help alleviate the fears, or that the fears don't actually need to be feared, they're trapped in the cycle of trying to get rid of the intrusive thoughts by acting out on the compulsions, even if that feels silly. Now, if you want to learn more about OCD itself, there's a short video on our website that goes into a bit more detail, and we'll link that in the show notes. But now, let's get into Mary's story. Mary shares with us what it's like to have your mental illness constantly making you question your faith, the Bible, or even if your family members are actually the devil in disguise. And she also talks us through her journey of finding the right treatment for a type of OCD that isn't widely as known about, especially when she was first seeking help. So here's our chat with Mary. So Mary, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself to start off?
I'm Mary. I'm from England. I'm currently in Australia visiting my sister who lives over here.
Yeah. Let's start at the start. I think before we get into your story a little bit too much, are you happy to tell us kind of what religious OCD is?
Yeah, so ultimately it is OCD. All OCD is treated in the same way, but religious OCD kind of covers different intrusive thoughts around faith. And so that will present differently for different people. People of all different religions can be affected by it. And so the obsessions and like the intrusive thoughts are all around faith and religion and those things. And then compulsions are, anything that you do to like try and kind of lower your anxiety and feel better and more reassured and stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, if listeners or watchers remember back to the episode with Jemima, we learned about how, obsessive compulsive disorder has these two parts. There is the obsessions, which come in, the intrusive thoughts that this is going to happen and you can't stop yourself from thinking that. And the more you think about it, the more kind of that anxiety builds within you. But then you also have these compulsions that you have to do a certain activity or action or say a certain thing to make the obsession or the intrusive thought not happen. In Jemima's example, it was around food and rubbish and cleanliness in her room, and if she didn't have her room perfectly spotless, there'd be rats and mice and everything like that, even though that was never going to happen. So religious OCD is then clearly all around faith and how those kind of obsessions and compulsions play out. So I think to help people understand this a bit more, are you happy to talk about how your religious OCD or how you first notice it, or what it was like for you to be dealing with religious OCD and what kind of some of those obsessions and compulsions were?
So for me, it started when I was about 9 or 10. I knew very little about anything mental health related. My parents, I've spoken to my mum more recently, and she was like, I just didn't know anyone with even like anxiety or depression. She probably did, but it wasn't spoken about.
Yeah.
There was just like no understanding of it in my house. It started with, I remember having different intrusive thoughts sort of about the devil. I remember this one thought, it always seemed to like focus on anything that would bring me joy. So like as a kid, I remember once my parents said we could go get pick and mix from like the store, and so this was like a really like special treat, and I was really excited. But then I just had this thought, this is the devil's food, and I was like, I don't know what that means, but I was just like, I felt really anxious because I was like, well, why have I thought that? What I felt really guilty for thinking that. And I remember I went to Mum and I was like, I've just had this thought. And then she, trying to help me, was like, well, if it's going to upset you, you don't have to eat it. I kind of then took that as like, it's sinful if I do eat this. So then I felt like I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do. Yeah. Because I felt like it was sinful or wrong. Like the thoughts that I was having. Yeah,
and was it kind of like then by your mum saying that, oh well, you don't have to eat it, that kind of confirmation that, oh yeah, this must be the devil's food then, and I have to stay away from it.
Yeah.
Was there other, was it bigger than just kind of food or things that brought you joy? Was it other activities in your life?
Yeah, it was everything. So. Along like a similar theme of like the thoughts about the devil, I remember thinking, obviously back in the Garden of Eden, Satan came as a snake, and so I was like, well, how do I know he's not going to do that again? And for some reason it focused on around my dad, and I was like, how do I know my dad isn't the devil? Like, what if he's the devil in disguise? Which is obviously like a distressing thought, especially as a kid. And obviously Mum was like, well, he's not. But I was like, yeah, but how do I know? You cannot prove to me that he isn't. So that was hard. And I had loads of doubts about everything. Just kind of the whole needing certainty or feeling like I needed certainty. So I just went right down the rabbit hole of how do we know that the Bible's trustworthy and all these things. And obviously to some extent those questions are normal, but I was only 9. And it was just like, I remember having like really intense conversations with my parents about it. And it was just like, we were never going to come to an answer that would satisfy me.
Yeah.
And it was just like a really intense time of my life.
Yeah. So as a 9-year-old, that's phenomenally heavy stuff to be trying to grapple with and wrestle with in your mind. Yeah, you can only imagine how distressed that would have made you. How did it, did it impact day-to-day life? Did it start to, kind of detract from your quality of life because you were dealing with this the whole time?
Yeah, massively. So I would, especially to start with, the answers or like the reassurance I was given would help. But then like the amount of time that they would kind of satisfy me was getting shorter and shorter. I remember once like having a conversation with Dad about like how we know we can trust the Bible, and I was kind of like satisfied, and then I was like, so we were downstairs, I went upstairs, I was only halfway up the stairs, and my brain was like, yeah, but what about this? And so it was just like not manageable to live like that. Yeah, like the space between like not having intrusive thoughts was getting smaller and smaller, and they were getting more and more frequent.
How did your, obviously, besides trying to talk you through it and trying to provide you some kind of reassurance, how did your parents kind of deal with this?
I know that they were just really confused, like talking, like they didn't necessarily tell me that at the time, but like talking to Mum now, she's told me like she was just like, what is going on? Like, this is weird. Like, I've never heard of this before. Like, yeah. So she was just completely out of her depth and had no idea what to do. And she was scared at the time. So she was hesitant for me to find treatment or therapy or anything, because one of the things she was scared about was because it was all kind of related to faith. She was scared that social services would take me off her because she thought they might be like, oh, well, like I've been indoctrinated and like that's causing all these problems. So I think she was, like it was really hard for her as well. And she didn't know what to do. And
So how did you kind of get through life in that stage? Were there, how did you actually kind of get through the next several years kind of thing?
I don't remember a lot of it. Yeah, I struggle to remember, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's sometimes one of our brain's most helpful things, that it sometimes just went, nope, that was a tough situation and we've got through it and we don't need to go back there. We don't need to be worrying about it anymore. So let's kind of fast forward a little bit then. So clearly this is something that has continued over your life. It wasn't just during that time when you were a 9-year-old. It kind of continued to exist. As you became kind of a teenager, later teenager kind of thing, did you start thinking about seeking help for yourself or things like that?
Yeah, so I started therapy when I was about 12. So I had like 2 or 3 years where I didn't have any treatment.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was so young, I didn't really understand that it was like mental health that I was struggling with. I was just like, I had no idea what was going on. But when I was about 12, I guess like because it was just, I guess like Mum didn't want to, like because of those fears, she wasn't keen on like getting outsiders involved. But I think because it didn't go away, like it wasn't just a phase, it was like ongoing for years. So then when I was like 12, I think she spoke to the pastor's wife at our church, kind of just like, what am I meant to do? And she encouraged like Mum to help me find a therapist.
Okay.
So that was like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But I wasn't really properly assessed when I started therapy. So in the UK, you like under the National Health Service with like free healthcare, you can have like free therapy. But one of the things with it, like being free, is not always done super thoroughly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wasn't really properly assessed. And also I was just like so afraid and ashamed of everything going on in my brain. I don't think I was like completely honest about what was going on. So I started treatment for generalized anxiety.
Okay. Yeah.
Which ultimately didn't help because that's not what was going on for me.
Yeah, that's sometimes it's often, well, this is how it could present, so let's start with the kind of simplest explanation and see where we go from there. You said Mum was talking to the pastor's wife who encouraged her to kind of find help for you. So what was church life like for you during this period?
So I think as a kid I'd always been like quite happy at church. I had like, that was my safe place, like all the people I was born and always went to the same church, so like all our family friends were there and stuff. And then I think around like that time when all the OCD stuff started, I think before then I didn't really kind of like pay that much attention. And I just kind of like, enjoyed seeing my friends and whatever, just pretty typical for a kid. And then when like the OCD started, then I kind of started like paying attention, but like not in a good way. And the church I was in at the time was very kind of focused on like judgment and not really God's grace. So I think like my siblings, they kind of, I guess, kind of just like took it with a pinch of salt, but I didn't, like with my OCD brain. So I just like, it was quite like scary hearing all those things. And then I'd often like after the service, I'd like go to Mum and be like trying to get reassurance, like, I'm not going to go to hell, am I? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's it. Especially when you're starting to try and think through those things and process those things, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, hang on, if these are the obsessive or the intrusive thoughts that I'm having around, I'm going to go to hell, or how do I know my dad is not the devil in disguise? Did it make you then want to start learn more and kind of hyper focus on kind of learning about the Bible or spiritual stuff or things like that?
I don't think so. I don't remember that being a thing. I think I was just so exhausted from like the constant thoughts.
Yeah. Were there certain compulsions that you had to do to try and manage those?
Yeah, so my compulsions were always, like, the biggest one was probably reassurance seeking. Like, I always wanted Mum to tell me that what I was worried about wasn't going to happen, or like what I was worried about wasn't true. So yeah, just kind of constantly going to her and being like I remember I went through a phase, this was maybe when I was a little bit older, I went through a phase when like probably like 5 times a day I would go to her and I'd be like, is everything okay? And she'd have to say, yeah, everything's okay. And then I could kind of like, I felt like I could handle life.
Yeah.
But like it would have to keep like, throughout the day I'd have to have her tell me that everything's okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, as I got a bit older, like I think to start with I was like really, really private and I didn't talk to anybody about what was going on. And then as I got a little bit older, like my best friend was very involved as well, and like I would always be, like trying to get reassurance from her as well.
Was that seeking reassurance one of those things that kind of the frequency between when you had to do that began to decrease as time went on, as things kind of got worse, that you kind of had to start seeking reassurance more and more?
Yeah, it was.
So yeah, as let's talk about as you started to get a bit older, kind of thing. Obviously, yeah, you're starting to share a little bit about this, about what you're going through. How was, how was that kind of time period? And I know that you were kind of not quite bouncing around, but had to try several different kind of therapists before you were able to kind of find some help that actually did help.
Yeah. So with the system in the UK, so I was under like the young people service. So that went up until I was 16. And then for some reason there's this gap between 16 and 18, and there isn't really anything for 16 to 18-year-olds. There's kind of like some online things, but like not really much. I think when I was like still in the, like when I was 16 and under, I got a lot of comfort from therapy. So it didn't, I wasn't getting any better, but I think I kind of felt like I must be getting better because I was in therapy. So it kind of like kept me stable, kind of just knowing that I was going to see a therapist.
Yeah.
And then there was like a couple of years when I was then out of therapy, and because all the things were like around like Christianity, then at that time I went to see a Christian therapist.
Okay.
To because I thought maybe she would be able to help. But she couldn't, because again we were like, we don't know what we're dealing with. She didn't know that it was OCD. And it was then when I was 18, 4 years ago this month, it was in October, I remember, one of my friends said, like, have you ever thought that like maybe you could be struggling with OCD? And I hadn't thought about that, and I just put into Google Christianity and OCD, and the stuff that came up, I was like, this is literally me. Wow. Like, how have I not come across this before? How has nobody known that this was me? Like, I remember I came down to Mum and I was like, Mum, read this. This is like actually me. And she read it and she was like, that is you. And then so then like from there, that was like the first time I actually felt hope, because I was like, maybe I can get better.
Yeah. Up until that point, was there kind of, like a complete lack of hope that this was just going to be what your life was like?
I think like at the very start, I didn't feel hopeless because, it was like a new thing I was experiencing. So I kind of didn't have anything to say that this is going to go on long term. But then like, as I got older and I saw like different therapists and like it was never getting better, that was hard. And then when I think I was about 17, I like became quite suicidal, because I was just like, there is no hope, like this isn't going to get better. I was living away from home at the time. I was doing a gap year like with a Christian organisation, and I had to come home early because like one day I was just like, I said to my friend there, I was like, I feel really suicidal. And so I was meant to come home just for the weekend, but it turned out like, nothing was getting better over the weekend. So I ended up like moving back home. That was kind of in the spring, and then it was like the October when I read this thing. So all those months were like really, really hard. And I just didn't want to be alive anymore because I could not see a way out. And then reading that thing, I was like for the first time, it was like there actually might be a way out of this.
So yeah, what was the beginning of the way out?
Again, I can't remember all of it, but I know I went to see a psychologist. It was someone sort of higher up than like the people I'd been seeing before, because obviously it had all gone kind of like missed before. So like we wanted to talk to someone higher up. So I was like quite hopeful for that, and I kind of thought, oh yeah, they'll get me therapy and it'll be a straightforward journey, which it wasn't. But so I went to see this psychologist, and he had never heard of religious OCD. So that was kind of the first thing where I was like, okay, this is not going to be straightforward. So I like spent that session like basically trying to explain to him what religious OCD was.
Wow.
And I'd only kind of like known for a couple of months that like this is what I was dealing with. And so he was like, okay, I'll do some research into it.
It's supposed to be the other way around, right? You're supposed to go to them and they're supposed to know what's going on.
Yeah, so it wasn't great. And then so I was put on like because I was like suicidal and stuff, I was fast tracked for therapy, but the waiting list, even like being fast tracked, was 6 months. So it wasn't until like the summer when I started therapy, this free therapy. So in the meantime, I started with another therapist who turned out to not actually have any qualifications.
Oh, no.
And she understood treatment for OCD, but she had no kind of like listening skills or compassion skills. And like at one point, because I was like still feeling really suicidal, I remember telling my therapist this, and she was like, or saying, you know, like I had told my mum, and she was like, well, you shouldn't tell your mum because that's really unfair. You're putting way too much pressure on her. You need to kind of just like pull yourself together.
Oh no.
So, yeah.
Wow. So then you got to actually see someone that could begin to help. What was that like?
Yeah, so it still wasn't straightforward from then. So then I went to see a Christian therapist who specialised in exposure and response prevention, which is like the gold standard treatment for OCD. She said that's what she specialised in, and she did do a bit of it. So that kind of was like starting to, you know, I was starting to get an understanding. But she really wanted to like look into trauma, because like often OCD is caused by trauma. But I kind of was like, well, the obvious thing is kind of my upbringing, being in like this unhealthy church. Like, I don't think there's any more than that. But she was like, no, we really need to keep looking. And so we'd spend like session after session, like trying to find this trauma. And, like nothing was coming up. And so that wasn't helpful. So I stopped with her. And then I found OCD, so that's the company I'm with now. They specialise in, like, they just work with people with OCD. Yeah, they're amazing. So they're based in the US, and so they didn't have any therapists licensed to work with people in the UK to start with. So that's why I probably would have just gone with them straight away, but I couldn't because they weren't licensed. A couple of years ago, they got therapists licensed in other countries, like in Australia, in the UK. So then I started with a therapist from there, and yeah, that's been really helpful.
Yeah. So where have you kind of come to now? What is it like for you now dealing with your OCD?
Yeah, so it's still like very up and down, but it, like, my life is so much less dictated by OCD. Like, I do the things that I want to do. I think like before getting the right treatment, I was very kind of controlled by how I was feeling. So if I felt anxious, like I wouldn't do something.
Yeah.
Whereas now my life is much more like I'll do something even if I'm feeling afraid. Like I'm the one in control. My OCD isn't in control. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. It's not about making the OCD no longer a part of your life, but about you're able to manage it now and actually live a fuller and healthier life, even with the OCD. That's really cool. And yeah, glad that you're at that point because yeah, that doesn't sound nice of where you were. It's really interesting because obviously religious OCD is so heavily tied to faith and what we believe and kind of these thoughts around, yeah, this might be the devil's food or my dad is the devil in disguise. But you are a person of faith. So I'd like to talk a bit more about that kind of side of things and about how you, especially as you began to grow up and we go from that stage of church is just where we've always gone because that's what our family did and that's where all our friends are to making our faith our own. What was that kind of like to begin to find your faith for yourself even while still having these religious OCD intrusive thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I became a Christian for myself when I was about 15. I remember as a kid I was really scared of hell, but I didn't want to be a Christian because of the church I was in. And everyone, it was like a cookie cutter, everyone was exactly the same, and piercings weren't allowed, tattoos weren't allowed, dyeing your hair wasn't allowed, all things which I love. And so as a kid, I remember kind of just being I'm such a creative person, and I think I kind of just felt like all that would be stifled if I became a Christian. So I was because kind of judgment was preached and not really grace, I did not see what was so good about Jesus. I was I don't want this. But then I didn't want to go to hell, so I was a bit confused. And then when I was 13, we moved to the church that I'm at now. And that was completely different. I think the biggest thing that struck me was that everybody was different and people were normal and all these things weren't forbidden, and people could actually come to church as themselves, not have to put on this front. But still, I think God was at work in my heart, but I still didn't fully understand who Jesus was. And so I was still kind of in that stage of I didn't want to go to hell, but I didn't really understand why Jesus was so great. And then when I was 15, so my family every year we go on holiday to this Christian camp, and I guess it was all things that I'd heard before, but the Holy Spirit opened my eyes for the first time.
Yeah.
And I for the first time I understood who Jesus was. And I didn't just want a get out of hell card. I was I actually want Jesus. I want to know him. I want to do life with him. But the thing stopping me was all my doubts. I was how can I do this if I'm not even sure that God exists? And I remember speaking to someone there, and they were well, doubts are normal. You can still be a Christian. So I remember praying with her, and I prayed, and I told God I want to know you, and I want to live for Jesus. And I didn't know, I'd kind of prayed that before, but it was always kind of in fear of hell. And so nothing ever changed. And so I didn't know really what to expect. I didn't know if anything was going to change, but it changed quite dramatically, and
Wow.
like it didn't change any of the OCD stuff, but I can quite clearly say, like, before then I didn't know Jesus, and now I do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that moment when, yeah, even for those of us that have grown up in the church all of our life and know these things in that head knowledge kind of thing, but that first moment when the Spirit opens our eyes and we truly see Jesus, it's such an amazing and beautiful moment. Yeah, that's really cool. So then, yeah, obviously, life has, well, your faith has changed, even if your life necessarily hasn't in terms of the OCD. So then, how did you go about, starting to live out a faith while still having all of these constant intrusive thoughts around doubt and this seeking of reassurance that, that God is real and those kind of things?
Yeah, so I think, like, to start with, my faith was quite compulsive. Like, I remember I was having, like, I kept thinking, like, having the intrusive thought, like, maybe you're not actually a Christian. And so I'd, like, constantly, like, ask my best friend, I'd, like, all the time be like, I am definitely a Christian, aren't I? And part of me was like, this reassurance thing isn't working, because, like, how can she know for 100% I'm a Christian?
Yeah.
But then I'd be like, well, she wouldn't lie to me, so I must be, like, kind of trying to convince myself that somehow I could be certain. Yeah, so that was all, like, around that time, and then it wasn't until so there was, like, about 3 years between then and then, like, finding ERP treatment, when I then kind of began to, like, tolerate uncertainty a bit more.
Yeah. We'll get to that tolerating uncertainty in a bit, but let's talk about ERP therapy, because that is kind of what made the big difference for you. So what is ERP therapy?
I love talking about ERP therapy. It's, like, the thing I'm most passionate about, because it literally saved my life.
Yeah.
So it stands for exposure and response prevention. And it's basically doing the exact opposite of what you would think you do to help somebody that's anxious.
Yeah.
So it involves doing exposures, which is just anything that will kind of bring on those intrusive thoughts. So instead of, like, running away from it all, you're, like, running towards it. So,
Wow.
Putting yourself in situations where you know that those thoughts are going to happen. Doing things that will trigger your OCD, and then it's kind of like rewiring your brain, so then you'll, instead of doing the compulsive behaviours, like, you don't do it, and so then that kind of, like, teaches your brain that, like, you can handle uncertainty.
Are you happy to share, like, from then, a religious OCD perspective, what did that actually look like?
Yeah, so for me, exposures, a lot of them have just kind of been everyday life things, because like, there are some things that will, like, specifically like, give me those intrusive thoughts, but a lot of the time it's just kind of anything every day. So that kind of makes it easier to do exposures, because I'm just constantly, like, I don't have to do much to kind of put myself in the way of those thoughts. But yeah, so one of the biggest things that I then had to change was, like, not going to other people for reassurance, which had, like, been such a massive part of my life for so long. And then, yeah, I had to, like, stop that. And then as well, another thing, like, my two biggest compulsions, so one was, like, going to other people for reassurance, and then the other was, like, ruminating and just, like, trying to figure things out in my head and trying to, like, come to an answer. So I had to like it's not a kind of, I just stopped doing it, like I had to really work on it. And like, it was like a slow process, and like I still sometimes do compulsions, but like it's a lot less than it was. Like my whole life was kind of controlled by trying to get certainty before.
Yeah. So then how has that impacted your faith then? Because if, a lot of it was around struggling with the doubt and needing the certainty, how do you deal with faith now, especially because, so many things we actually can't like be certain of, and that's part of what faith is having that belief, even though we can't necessarily see the evidence of it right in front of us.
I think the whole like doubt about like God's existence or like Christianity being true, that has taken quite a while to like work on, because I think like I was having other intrusive thoughts as well, like maybe I've done this wrong, maybe this was a sin, whatever. And that was kind of, I guess, a lower level fear, and I felt more able to, like another thing, like part of ERP is saying maybe not, like to kind of like live in that uncertainty. And so I was kind of at a place where I could say that about some things, but like I just felt like I could not say maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. So I think that was like a thing that I was really struggling with. I just felt like I could not bring myself to accept that I was uncertain, like that I couldn't prove. But then like finally, probably like 2 years into it, I was like, okay, I'm just going to fully go for this. And that was just massively helpful, because then my brain, I guess, kind of learned like, I'm not going to get certainty on this, but that doesn't have to affect how I live my life. Like I can not know, but I can still put my trust in Jesus. Like that is what faith is. Like, I don't know, some people seem to be really certain, but I have loads of doubts. But it's just been amazing.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, is it something that was hard for you to perhaps, come across those people that are so very certain of their faith and their salvation? Did that kind of make things worse, or that comparison would trigger things off for you again?
Yeah, I think evangelical Christians are quite not great at accepting uncertainty. And I think, I've always grown up, like in my old church and even in my church at the moment, I think there's just a lot of people that kind of want to say like, this is absolute, this is definite, this is 100% trustworthy. And I don't know, it's just weird, because it's not that, like, I would never be like, oh yeah, let's not teach people that the Bible can be trusted and stuff, because like I've based my whole life on like taking Jesus to be who he says he is. But then like, I don't know, like some people, like what I just said, some people seem to not doubt that, but I do doubt that, and I can find it even now still hard to like be honest about that, because it feels like, how can you doubt something so like so massive? But I'm kind of learning to be a bit more open about it, because like I find it so helpful when other people are open with me about like them having doubts. And I just think it's really important that people know that they're not alone, and that like having doubts is normal, and not being certain is normal, and that still doesn't, like, you can still have a thriving relationship with God even like with those thoughts.
Yeah, that was a big part of my own story, is that no one seemed to talk about that, facing these difficulties in life made me ask all those big questions, like, what is the point of this? If this is what, if this is what faith and life is bringing together, is this kind of struggle and angst and concern about absolutely everything, then why? And I'd go to church and go to small group, and no one would talk about this, and so I thought there was clearly there's something wrong with my faith. Then everyone else has got this figured out. There's something wrong with my faith. I've missed something. I don't know what's going on. But yeah, like I've learnt to live in that grey of going. I'm not going to have all the answers, and I don't have any. And this is one of the interesting things, because I don't have any OCD at all, but I do still have doubt. And plenty of other people still have doubts about faith. And I think to some degree there is a healthy level of doubt, because it encourages us to trust more, and it encourages us to learn more and to seek more and to strive more. But obviously then when you throw religious OCD into the mix, that can become a whole consuming, overwhelming beast that, thankfully a lot of us don't have to deal with. Unfortunately, you do, as much as that sucks. So I want to talk about the Bible a bit, because that's another thing that you kind of mentioned. It was one of those kind of doubts or questions that you kept going back to, like, well, how can we believe this, and how can we know it's true? How did you begin to learn to... Yeah, you said you kind of got to this point where you can trust Jesus and see Jesus for who he is, but did it take you a while to learn to be able to trust that, the Bible, the Word of God, or the Bible is the Word of God and is something we can trust?
I think it's been another slow thing, and another, like, it's been something over time. But I think it's one of those things where you can't kind of be like, I know God can be trusted, so I feel like I've had to put my trust in him, and then he's proven that he's trustworthy. Like, I can't... Like, the more I try and figure out, can the Bible be trusted? Like, is it the Word of God? And try and get answers to that, the more uncertain I feel. Whereas the more I just actively live my life and trust Jesus, the more things kind of seem to fall into place. And then I'm like, okay, well, this makes sense. Like, from my life, I can see that, like, the Bible must, like, it is valid. Like, I can see, like, because I've taken action and it's proved itself, rather than kind of just sitting around passively waiting to feel kind of convinced about its, like, trustworthiness.
Yeah. You're not waiting to go, okay, now I believe it's true, so now I'll start acting it out and live it out. You've taken that step of faith to start living it out, and have seen that, God has, confirmed that in your life, which is amazing, and such an amazing testament to, what he does. But I'm interested then, for someone with religious OCD, and especially with, intrusive thoughts around religion and faith and things like that, like, are there parts of the Bible that you wrestle with more than others, or that are, like, difficult for you to read?
Things that kind of seem to contradict themselves, or things that you can't, like, fully understand. I find difficult, because I kind of feel like I want black and white, and I want to understand it. And I'm also autistic, so I think that kind of comes into play as well, kind of the wanting things to be black and white, and like, it's just not, like, nothing in life is black and white. And so those things like predestination, like, do we choose God or does God choose us? I'm kind of like, I need to know, but, like, there is just not a clear-cut answer. And I've had a bit of, like, another thing I really struggle with is the whole thing about, like, rewards in heaven. And like, I'm like, so are, like, some Christians better than others? But, like, that kind of, like how does that fit in with like grace and we all need God and just things, that like it's like I can't put the two things together. And like I feel like for most people they kind of just accept that, but like with having OCD and just like that need for certainty, it's like really hard to kind of let go and kind of just be like, I don't understand this, and that's okay.
Yeah, completely understand that, because for some people they can go, cool, it's a grey issue and that's okay, but clearly your OCD makes the ability for you to sit with that as an unknown so much harder, and I'm guessing then takes so much more mental effort and energy to allow yourself to go, I don't know the answer to this. I am just going to trust. But does that play into things like, I think of the verse that, says to take captive every thought. Does that play into that side of thing with intrusive thoughts and OCD about, the Bible is telling me to take captive every thought, but the reality is I have intrusive thoughts on a daily basis and I can't do that. Does that kind of add to that, inability to sit in the grey at times?
Yeah, so I think it definitely used to. I think I've kind of come to an understanding now that like when the Bible kind of talks about anxiety and like these things like, do not be anxious, all these things, like I feel like it's talking about something different than people who have like a mental disorder. And like I can see in my life like there are things that I worry about and I'm like, no, actually I shouldn't, because I can see that is a lack of me trusting God. But then there's other things like OCD things which it doesn't mean I'm not trusting God. Same with like taking every thought captive. Like at one time that would have like really stressed me out and I would have kind of been like, right, I need to control all my thoughts. But I think as I've gotten older, I've kind of come to more of an understanding that like God isn't asking us to do the impossible.
And that's where grace comes in as well, because if it was a matter of we had to do all these things and then we got salvation, heaven would be empty, because none of us would be able to reach that standard. But like I'm really encouraged to hear that, for you to say that at one time that would have been a really stressful thought, but you are able to acknowledge that, this is not something I can necessarily control, but also that you can begin to identify, or not begin, but that you can identify that, hey, these passages are talking about a different type of anxiety that all of us face, as opposed to a mental illness or something like that I struggle with, which is, I think, for a long time we've got hung up on that because it's used, specific words, or use the word anxiety or anxious or things like that, and we equate it with everything, which is huge, because I think the real hope for people is that it shows is that there is that ability for your mental health to exist and coexist with your faith, and it doesn't mean that your faith has to suffer as a result. Yes, it might make it more difficult at times, but you can clearly see the difference between when it's my mental health that is causing me to ask these questions or not trust, or whether it is actually hey, I'm actually not trusting Jesus enough with this aspect of my life. That's a huge encouragement to me, even. I guess, kind of to round things out and kind of wrap it up, how do you kind of see your future to some degree? Is it something where you're comfortable knowing now that, hey, the OCD might be something that you have to live with for, the rest of your life? It might just be something that is there. But you're able to separate your faith out from it now, even though it is specifically religious OCD?
I think I still feel quite overwhelmed if I look into the future. It kind of depends on the day. Like some days I feel positive about the future and kind of like, things are getting better. They're going to continue to get better. like, look how far I've come, you know, I have a bright future. And then, like, I think when I'm kind of having when I'm having like a bit of a relapse, I guess, into symptoms, then I feel a lot less positive about the future.
Yep.
So I'd be lying if I say I kind of feel positive all the time. I don't. Like, some days I do still feel really kind of like really pretty not good about the future. But yeah, taking it one day at a time, really.
Yeah. And what kind of hope and encouragement does your faith give you in that aspect?
Massive encouragement. Knowing that, like, one day I'm not going to have to deal with this. And that, like, I don't know where it is, but the Apostle Paul talks about our sufferings, and he calls them light and momentary. And so to think that the glory that I'm going to experience one day, like, I'll look back on this and think that was light and that was momentary, like, two words that I would never use to describe OCD, like the complete opposite. But like, in heaven, that is going to, like, all this is going to completely just pale into insignificance. Like, that just gives massive hope, knowing that that is coming, and like, this isn't going to be something I forever live with. Like, on this earth I have to live with it, but this is just the start. Like, all of eternity is waiting, and like, I'm gonna get to experience life without OCD. And then, like, while I'm in the thick of it, knowing that I have Jesus is a massive comfort, because so often I feel misunderstood, and like, people don't understand, and like, I don't understand myself. Like, the amount of times I pray and I'm like, I just don't understand my head and what is going on, and like, why am I thinking like this, and like, just completely out of my depth. And it's just so comforting that Jesus knows, and that he's got me, and that I'm safe, that I'm held by him, and that, like, my thoughts can't change that. And that, that gives me like a lot of comfort and security.
Yeah, that's amazing. And yeah, what an amazing hope that we do have to cling on to. Hey, that's fantastic. Mary, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's such an encouraging story to hear. Even for those of us that don't suffer with religious OCD, just the way you are able to focus on that hope and see what Jesus is doing and trust him in the midst of those days where things aren't easy is a real encouragement. But I think also a real testament to the power that he has and the work that he can do in our lives to see where you've come from to where you are now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you do, either with NoCD or with your advocacy page as well online, and kind of what you're hoping to do through that?
Yeah, so I think I'm just, like, the reason I'm so passionate about all of this is because I can see the difference understanding what OCD has made to my own life. And I just think if I had known this sooner, I could have gotten help so much sooner. So I really care about people understanding what OCD is, and knowing that there is help available. So yeah, the company NoCD do a lot of, they do therapy, but they also do free support groups, which are incredible because they're free, and you can just they're on Zoom, so you kind of, wherever you are, people all over the world, you can log in and talk to other people that are, like, they have lots of different ones, so there'll be like a religious OCD one, there's one that I go to as well that is like for people that are autistic and also have OCD. Like, it just covers everything. And that really helps you know that you're not alone. And then I also have an Instagram page where I kind of post just different things about OCD and ERP and that journey.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We'll make sure we've got the links to those in the show notes and in the description below. So if people want to find out more or follow along, they can do that. But yeah, Mary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. If it was helpful or encouraging, we'd love for you to drop a like on this video, share it around. You can see way more content on our website at anxiousfaith.org, where you can listen to each episode of the podcast, find resources and read our blog around mental health and faith. Be sure to also follow us on socials via the links in the description and subscribe to our channel so you can be kept in the loop when we're dropping more content for you. Thanks so much and God bless.